This is your Persuasive Writing videocast. I'm Trent England-Director of the Citizenship and Governance Center at the Evergreen Freedom Foundation. And we're going to spend just a few moments here talking about how to be an effective activist by persuasively communicating using letters to the editor and going over 5 of my most basic rules for actually getting your letter to the editor once you've written it or as you're writing it, getting it published in a newspaper, because that's oftentimes one of the most difficult and most discouraging things for activists who are out there writing letters to the editor. But sometimes it's also the most easy thing to remedy, is solving one of these 5 issues to get your newspaper to actually print your letter. The first rule is to know how to count. Okay, now this is basic, and I don't mean to be condescending, but the first rule really is know the word limit. Know how to count the words in your letter and make sure that you're under that limit. This is the most basic rule, but it's also something that we oftentimes miss or don't think about. And sometimes newspapers, I'm going to show you a couple samples. This is the News Tribune in Tacoma. Their limit is 250 words, but they say very clearly they prefer and will give preference to letters that are 150 words or less. And you can see these samples of some of their letters to the editor pages. Some of these letters are really short. It's hard to write letters this short. I've heard lots of complaints from people saying, how can I possibly boil it down to 100 or 200 words? We have to do it because this is a hard and fast rule. Newspapers, they're not going to give you a couple extra words. If it even looks like it's close, they might cut you off. And if they have a lot of letters, they're going to prefer to print shorter letters from more people in most cases. Now, here's an example of the Wall Street Journal letters to the editor page. You'll notice these letters are a lot longer. It's a different paper. They have a different audience. They have different things that they prefer for their letters to the editor page. But it's just critical. This is, as I say, it's a hard and fast rule. We have to meet the word requirement in our letters to even have a chance at getting them printed in the paper. Tip 2 is use their format, and this is related directly to the first rule, knowing the word count. This is not as hard and fast an issue, but when you look at the sample from the News Tribune, from the Wall Street Journal, and from some of these other letters to the editor pages, you'll see that the letters actually look different. Without reading them, without focusing on the substance or even the grammar or anything like that, they look different on the page. That's because a lot of newspapers prefer letters to the editor written in a kind of newsy format, very short paragraphs, 1-2 sentences per paragraph oftentimes. Other newspapers, again like the Wall Street Journal, they will take a typical length paragraph, 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences, which in those narrow columns looks like a huge long block of text, and they'll print that. That's fine, but we need to be looking at the newspapers and thinking about what are they expecting, or what do they want their page to look like. We need to match up with that to make it easy for the editor to say, yeah, I'm going to run with this letter, just glancing at it without even reading it. This looks like something that belongs on my editorial page. Okay, tip number 3 is to make the connection. Newspapers, in this day and age especially, have very fragile self-esteem. They need to feel like you're reading and you care, like you're an important part, or they're an important part of your life. And so oftentimes in the first sentence, or at least in the first paragraph of your letter, you're going to need to refer to something in the newspaper to say to them, I'm actually reading your paper, and I care about what it says, and I'm responding to something that you've specifically written about within the last couple days, within the last week, maybe 2 weeks at the outside. And you also can, once again, look at the format. Some newspapers always, first of all, include a reference. They won't run a letter that doesn't reference something that's been in the paper. And they most often have a format that they use. Maybe it's in parentheses, maybe it's not. But you want to match exactly whatever format they use, and to know if they always run letters with a reference to a story. If you send something in that's not about something that's been in their paper recently, they're just not going to run your letter. So rule 3 is to make that connection to something that's been in the paper before, especially if it's a requirement for that newspaper. Okay, tip number 4, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, respect. This is an important rule. It should be a common sense rule, except for people like me who, especially in my younger activist days, when I wrote a letter to the editor, it was usually late at night and I was very angry about something. And I know from talking to people I'm not alone. A lot of us write when we get mad, and that's okay. That's the moral indignation that we feel is perfectly appropriate, and it's perfectly appropriate that even come through in our letters to a certain degree, but it's also critical. And this goes not only to being printed in the newspaper, to getting by that editorial page editor or his flunky, but also to actually being persuasive in the things that we write, to being able to not simply vent or preach to the choir, but to reach the people who are persuadable, which oftentimes we're talking about people in the middle, people who, they don't want to associate with political radicals, with people who are out there being venomous and vitriolic. We need to think about who in our culture connects with the people in the middle. That would be folks like Oprah. Not that we all have to write like Oprah, but we do have to be respectful to people. We have to be respectful to the newspaper editor, and whoever that audience is. It's a critical part of our writing, and that's why that's tip 4 to getting our letters to the editor printed in the newspaper. Okay, tip 5, this is the last of our tips for getting our letters to the editor printed, is know your customer. And your customer, when you're thinking about getting your letter to the editor printed in the newspaper, is that newspaper and their editorial page staff, the people who are going to be looking at your letter and making that decision. And the best way I know of to do this is to just collect several days or maybe even several weeks worth of that newspaper's editorial page and look at what is it that they run, what is it that they're talking about, what do they like to talk about. There may be some oddball letters that slip through here and there, but what are the themes of that editorial page? Do they seem to only run letters with a certain tone or a certain voice? Are they willing to run things that give out public officials' email addresses? That's very uncommon, but I've seen that before. I've seen newspapers that will allow people to ask their other newspaper readers to do something very specific, some act of activism. That's great, and if they'll let you do that, you want to take advantage of it. On the other hand, if they never run letters like that, don't send one in because it'll find its way into the round file. The place where most of the letters, unfortunately, go. We have to know the newspaper, and they all are so individualistic. They have their own editor. Sometimes the editor might have changed since you sent in your last letter. So looking at some recent issues, some recent copies of the editorial page, that's the way to get a feeling for what are they actually willing to print, what do I need to take advantage of, what must I shy away from, what are those word limits, what do the letters look like, what can I do, how can I be the most effective activist, the most persuasive communicator, and get a letter to the editor published in this newspaper? That's the question. I hope that these 5 tips have helped you to think about that. I know these are some basic things, and tune in to future editions of your Persuasive Writing video cast for some more elaboration on how we can make our letters and all of our writing, all of our communication as effective as possible. Thanks so much.